Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Welcome to TSS, the person that are here in person and our viewers from the internet. Very happy to have you all. Today is a beautiful day outside. It's gorgeous. The skies is blue. It's just amazing. And the weather is just beautiful. With the flowers come the allergy season. But it's all good. It's all good. So I'm going to start with our initial reading, and then I'll give you more some other information. Okay, so the reading is from the book Happy Life, from Givaldo Pereira and Joana de Angelis. When you are at the point of quitting something worthwhile, pray and continue to the end. When you find yourself ready to make a mistake, pray and calmly avoid it. When you realize that you do not have the strength to do your good work, pray and get new energy and arrive at your planned destination. When tempted into a bothersome situation, pray and get your balance back. When you feel abandoned by the person you believe in or whom you love, pray and have patience remaining at your post. When you are discouraged and ready to fall down without any courage, pray and you'll be granted the stamina for victory. Never stop praying. So let us pray. Dear God, Jesus, our master of love, our guiding light, all the spirits present here today, the incarnate and discarnate ones, we pray to you, God. We pray to you, Jesus, to give us the strength, to give us the light, to continue in this path that we chose to follow your path of goodness, of happiness, of love, and of growth. We ask you to be with us, especially be with Marco, our brother, who will be giving us the lecture today. And we also ask for those who couldn't come here today, but they are listening to us through the internet or wherever they are. So be with us. So be it. So today Marco will be talking to us about the spiritual view on racism, sexism, and homophobia. It's a topic that usually we don't hear very much, but it's very important for us to understand and to get in touch with these topics, because especially through the Spirit's view. So thank you so much, Marco, for bringing this to us. And before I end, I just want to let you know that today we have the Lunch and Learn. So for those who we would love to have you here so we can have some social time together. Okay? Thank you, Marco.
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So as you can tell, today we're going to talk about three very important, very challenging topics that we can easily have like a whole week of course about each one of them individually. So the goal today is not to really go and give like a long and complex, evaluation and analysis of all those topics, but rather bring some of Spiritism into this context. So another thing important to tell is that I'm not a specialist, disclaimers, I'm not a specialist in any way on homophobia or transphobia. I'm not a specialist in racism or sexism. I don't study that. But I read a little bit about Spiritism, so I can hopefully make that connection and bring some interesting things about Spiritism that I can almost certainly guarantee that we don't think about on a day-to-day thing. So my goal today is try to take something that we're leaving right now in our society and bring some light into it based on what we believe from the work of Kardec. Let's see if we can go through that journey. Okay. So with all those disclaimers in place and like a full understanding of the conversation today, let's talk about some important concepts. So let's start with racism. Okay. So interestingly enough, the word racism is actually very new, right? It's actually probably not a lot more than 100 years old, because the entire concept of racism is actually new, right? Interesting thing is that, do races exist in human sapiens like us? What do you guys think? Do we have races? No? Yes? Maybe? No? Okay, no. Like humans do not have races or subspecies. We're one species by biology. And I don't know facts now. Let's talk about that part I know. Okay, let's talk about science now. What do you think is more diverse genetically? Like two penguins or an African American and a Caucasian European? Yes, by a lot, right? Or from the same species, two mice, right? They're far more divergent, genetically speaking. They have a lot more variability in their genome than actually any one of us from anywhere in any continent or any culture. They're the same. So this is an interesting concept because we use races in the day-to-day conversation. We say, oh, race and race this and race that. And, we say ratio this or ratio that, right? And even like in clinic, sometimes we give diagnoses, we say racial discoloration or racial pigmentation, which is something completely nonsensical. This is like an adaptive trait, right? So now science, this is not new, right? Science knows this for a long time. So they've evaluated the genetic and biology components of who we are as a species, right? As an animal species from the animal kingdom, in many different ways. And it's pretty evident that from a biological perspective, races don't exist. So what is racist then? It's a social construct. So this is how, for many hundreds of years, right, societies or groups, right, have used that to subjugate others, right, based on this categorization of how we look or how we talk or, behaviors, culturally accepted behaviors and not accepted behaviors. So we tend to group others, right, by particular traits. But most of those things are either social, cultural, or adaptive, right? For example, if someone has more melanin in the skin or less melanin in the skin, how many genes do you think regulate that? Do you think the person's different genetically? We're probably more closely related to people that look completely different from us than the one that looks just like us, because the set of genes that regulate skin and color-wise, this is like, a couple of genes, maybe 6 in total, that regulates all of that. And those are all adaptive. In other words, depending on where you live, you're going to have a tendency to have different appearances because of their environment, right? So just to start with a big bang, say we're going to talk about something that doesn't even exist. Okay, so let's talk about that. This is going to be very interesting. Okay. Now, if we think about the concept that actually it doesn't exist, and then we talk about what is racism now, that we are adding a little, we're changing a little bit the concept, right? So if you look at the dictionary, right? So we categorize this is a prejudice, right? Discrimination or antagonism or violence against others that are, a person or a group of people, right, that share particular traits, right? Or it could be any traits that are typically visible, because we tend to judge people by how they look all the time, right? Or how they talk or how they behave, right? We also, if you look at dictionaries, some dictionaries will even bring a concept that there is a belief, this is from history now, that race is a fundamental determinant of traits. In other words, is someone from race X or race Y, so they all look the same and do the same, so they're different than us, right? And typically that's used when societies tend to subjugate or to control others, right? So they will assign a set of traits that's particular to a region, right? And they'll say those are inferior than the others. So they create a little scale, like, you know, this is better, this is worse, right? And society tries to, you know, create those. And this is not new, right? This happened since the beginning of our society. When we started living in civilizations, when we started to be, you know, instead of roaming around and find places to eat, when it settled down and it started to create groups and the groups started to differentiate from each other's, there's competition that started for food, for space, for, you know, for places to grow. That competition evolved into collaboration between groups that needed that collaboration. So that's called social adaptation, right? So socially, we're social animals, right? So we started to learn from each other, and to a point that, you know, at some point we kind of looked and act and behaved in a particular way because of where we are, right, and the conditions of where we are. And then when that expanded to larger groups, now the groups become a little bit antagonist, right? Because depending on where you are, where you're from, you're going to look and act differently. That's where this concept of like there versus us started. This is part of our normal evolution of humanity, right? So obviously, one thing that we have to think, and I'm quite sure that most of us don't think about it, is that when Kardec was writing the 5 books that we consider like the key, you know, knowledge, right, from the works of Kardec, the basic books, during that time, it was the peak, the height of the concept of races, right? That's when really science was really trying as hard as possible to prove that races were real and people were different, and therefore one was better than the other. That was the height of it, right? At that time, we didn't have genetic sequencing. We didn't even know what DNA was, right? We did things by observation, right? So we'd go to a place, observe. Remember Darwin's experiments, right? We'll observe, we'll take notes, and we'll derive hypotheses and we prove them, right? By observation at that time. So what was happening at that time, you know, a lot of the scientists would go to places with different cultures and different behaviors. They'll take notes, they'll see what they do. And if a particular individual, instead of using a forged iron, cast iron tool, was using a little piece of rock, they assumed that that was an inferior behavior. So that was an inferior individual. So that was, the entire group was labeled as an inferior race, right? If they looked different, right? They were doing exactly what they're doing, looking at animals, right? And looking at animal behavior. They were kind of assuming that differences they were transplanted to humans, and then they assumed that similar to different animals and different behaviors, humans had the same thing. So that's why the concept of races were so strong at that time. And it was scientifically acceptable. So actually the discussions in science were exactly about that. The papers, we can pull, you know, the entire literature at that time had that vivid, right? The idea that, you know, races are different, and yes, and blacks are different than yellows, and they're different, that is a common concept. So when Kardec was writing the books, that was the Parisian Society, this scientific society, not the Spiritist Society, the real science society that was part of, had those discussions. And he brings those discussions, for example, in the Spiritist magazine. So if you go to Spiritist magazine, the 1862, there's a little article about the black race and the development of the black race, which is, now we read it, we say, oh, that's racist, right? But no, what Kardec was doing at that time was to bring that scientific discussion and incorporate an ability or a chance to discuss in a spiritist perspective. In the posthumous work, for example, there's an article about that talks about beauty, right? And if you look just the preamble of the article, you say, oh, this is a racist article because it says that some faces are more beautiful than others, or something that they used to do at the time. They used to evaluate the shape of the cranium and say, this individual is better than the other, or more beautiful, or whatever, right? It's more symmetrical, or the lips are less thick, or more, they used to do that. But if you finish and we're going to talk about it, if you go through the entire article, the spirits are going to address that in the same article and say, doesn't matter, right? Beauty comes from spirit, right? Not from the body. Body's like, So there's all these little things that if we don't take perspective and we say, this is what was happening at that time, this is what we have, some people will actually attack Kardec based on those little articles, right? But obviously, we're going to say something different today, right? So if you go to Spirit's book, this is now going back to the basics, right? So question 52, Kardec is going to ask, and see, the questions Kardec are asking is about race all the time, because this is a concept that is accepted at the time, right? But see how the spirits are going to answer, right? So the question is, where did the physical and moral differences that distinguish the Earth's various races come from, right? So that's Kardec asking the spirits, right? Look at the spirits are going to say. And this is actually 100% in agreement with what we believe today are the differences between people. Like he's saying, from climate, lifestyle, and custom. So these are adaptive behaviors, right? Adaptive changes, right? Because of where you are and what you do and then who you live with, right? The same would happen if two siblings from the same mother were each raised differently and far apart. They would show no moral resemblance to each other. In other words, they would be different from each other, right? Because of, the different conditions and scenarios, right, they experience too. So you see, the answer from the spirit does not talk about races, right? Because the spirit, obviously, this is how we should interpret this, right? The spirits are actually teaching Kardec that you shouldn't even be really talking about this concept, right? Continue, 53. Did humankind first appear at various points on the globe? And then the spirit's obviously right, and it's correct, yes. But at a different periods, which is other cause the human race is so diverse. Later, humankind spread throughout the different climatic zones and explored new types and terrains, right? And then they continue. Kardec, it's a second question of the same question. Do these different races imply distinct species, right? And the spirits are going to say, certainly not, right? So the spirits are far more advanced than the science at that time. And this is shocking, right? So imagine, we're having a conversation, and I always try to think about today, because, we're talking about, of course they were going to say certainly not. We know that 150 years later, right? Because I can guarantee you now, if we're having a mediumistic meeting, a spirit comes and say, here, all you know about matter is actually incorrect. Your experiments are flawed. We're going to be like seriously, right? The spirit is like cuckoo, right? But this is exactly what was happening at that time, right? Now we can read it and say, yeah, that makes sense, right? But we're just a few hundred years behind in scientific terms, right? So, and then he continues. All are the same family. So actually he puts us in the same family, like a group of people that have the same traits, right? Do the different varieties of the same fruit mean that they do not all belong to the same species? Bingo, right? So do you remember how Jesus used to teach people at the time? Right? So Jesus, obviously, the most perfect and supremely intelligent spirit that ever came close to us, he would actually draw on the floor. He would just stick to draw on the ground. He would spit on the ground and do little things. He would talk about fishermen, right? He would talk about, all sorts of things, and the seed of the mustard and mountains, right? Why? Because that's what we could take at that time, right? So the spirits are certainly saying kind of the same pattern, right? They're saying, well, think about fruits, think about this. But in reality, they're teaching us such an important lesson, is that, yes, we're all the same. Stop this, right? So it's a clash, right, between the science at the time, right? And then he continues, right? All of us are brothers and sisters in God because we're all animated by the same spirit and we strive towards the same goal. So we always want to take those. And he now teaches Kardec. He says, you, us, right? Kardec and us, always want to take words literally, right? Because that is a scientific approach, right? Then Kardec was a scientist, right? So he also takes, the Spirit's take an opportunity to kind of give a little lesson to us, right? So that's good news, right? That's really what Spiritism is about. So again, going back to Kardec and races, right? So yes, Kardec talk about races all the time in every single book, multiple times in Spiritist book, multiple times, and that is the scientific accepted terminology at the time. But not only that. So Kardec and the spirits talk about races in totally different ways. For example, when they're talking about the spirits that came from Capella, they talk about human races and the other races. So in other words, these are now two different varieties of spirits, and they use the word races interchangeably for that, right? So they also they talk about races in evolutionary perspective. So in Spirit's book, they'll talk about the archaic humans, for example, the Homo erectus, for example, which is like, several million years before us, right? They'll say that's a different race, and they're right? Those are not Homo sapiens, right? Those are the different type of hominidians that came before us, right? So they talk about that. So they use many different ways, the concept of race. And if we're not careful enough to separate those things, we kind of may believe that, they're using races in a racist way, which is not true, right? And obviously, Kardec is the same person that says later on, that says, if you find any scientific theory down the road that proves me wrong, take that, right? So he knew that the science at the time was flawed, some of it, right? And our science today, some of it is still flawed. And in 100 years, our science is still partially flawed, because that's how science evolves, by making mistakes and proving them right or proving them wrong, and then building from the ones that are right, right? So when he says that, he pretty much addresses many of these concerns too, because he's saying, if you find down the road, and the spirits already told him that races don't exist, right? But if you find down the road that science now proves that, so take that. No, beautiful. So we don't have to disagree, because the science of today is basically proving the exact same concept that the spirits told Kardec 150 years, 160 years ago, right? So bingo, perfect, right? So what else? So there's a lot more, right? So the same, so that was summary of things about race and spiritism, right? So from different literature that I was able to find, okay? So the Spirits magazine in 1861, Kardec's going to say, Spiritism restoring to the spirit its true role in creation by demonstrating the superiority of the mind over the matter, right? The spirit over the matter, naturally puts an end to all established distinctions among humans according to bodily or worldly advantages, upon which pride alone founded casts prejudices of color. You cannot be more clear than this, right? So Kardec is telling us, without any doubt, that Spiritism is actually the antidote, is the perfect antidote to the idea of racism, right? Because it proves that who we are, what to do, and what we look like is determined by who we really are as a spirit, right? And what we need in our incarnation, or what we need to learn, or what we need to do, right? So the body really doesn't matter. We're all the same. So I can come in a white body, big body, low body, this and that, and this does not make, we're still exactly the same as a spirit, right? So he, on the Spiritist magazine, in the multiple articles, he will go back to this multiple times, right? And why does he do it? Because at that time, slavery was actually accepted legally in Brazil, United States, right? There were, in Europe, obviously, they were blocking the trade, but there were still slaves around, right? So it was a process that was rolling, right? But imagine this, you're living in a society that is capable of going to another country, continent, right? Taking an individual from their place and their family, right? Treating them like far worse than any other animal, right? Because they didn't do that to other animals, right? And treating them such in a different way that they're considered some type of like a trade, right? Like an object, right? You take this, you take that, right? And you do this, right? Without any rights, any respect for individuality, for anything. Right? So they're living in a society that that was the norm. So that's why you're going to actually find repeatedly, right, in the Spiritist magazine, this very clear comment from Kardec about um, how abhorrent that is, and how if you take a Spiritist perspective and if you start seeing people through the eyes of the Spirit, you realize how wrong that is. And the Spirit's obviously going to hit that nail multiple times, right? So there is a part on Spirit's book that talks specifically about slavery, right? And obviously you can't be more clear than that. So question 829. So Kardec's going to ask the Spirit. So what about the some of the people that think that the races, again the concept of races, right? They're so some of them are kind of domesticated beasts, right? That's how they see Black people at that time. Like they treated them like some sort of a wild animal, right? They domesticate and they force to do things, right? So what is that? Like, do they have the right to do that, right? And obviously the spirits are going to be clear. Of course not, right? So and the spirits are going to say, the folly of those who do not look beyond matter, right? In other words, we're still going to the same concept, right? Only looking at the matter and the differences, right? And obviously, there's also another concept at that time that our planet has been at war so many times because of it. The idea that some individuals are better than others, right? They're more evolved. Again, makes no sense if you look at the Spiritist perspective, because it's the same person, right? We can incarnate anywhere, anytime, any culture, right? And the spirits are going to go back in the question number 832, and they say, it is not the blood that must be pure or less pure. It is the spirit. Right? Now, these are concepts, again, that for us makes a lot of sense, and we can kind of connect to it, but at that time, this is actually big news. So much big news that they got into trouble selling that story, right? So, when Kardec was trying to, tell people about this, there was pushback, right? Pushback from the church, pushback from the society, right? Pushback from governments and all sorts of individuals in society that saw that as a threat, right? How come you tell someone at that time that someone who's different, like Black or yellow, whatever, like whatever differences you think in the body at that time, would be the same as a rich Caucasian, right, in Europe? How dare you do that? That is actually bad, right? Society had this massive pushback against it, right? And I think Spiritism brings that incredible beacon of light, right, to this entire conversation. So, but are we different, though? Like, are we different? Yes or no? It's an easy question, right? I'm saying that races don't exist. It's all adaptive. Genetically, we're all the same, right? Yes, we are different. But why? Not because of the way we look, right? But who we are as a spirit through the collective evolution that we've been through. Each one of us here took so many different roads to be here today. Each one of us have experiences. We have made mistakes. We had corrected some of them. We did a lot of things right. We did a lot of things wrong. That is part of the reincarnation and the evolution, right? That's also another concept that we learned from Kardec. So if our roads are different, it means that, yes, we are different. We have different experiences. We think different ways, right? But what we as a society still emphasizes like how different we look, right? That makes no sense, right? But we are unique because we are unique spirits, right? We're not the same, spiritually speaking, because of those experiences. But the best news is that we will be perfect one day. So, in other words, as more as we evolve, the less differences we're going to have from a moral perspective. Think about that. If you guide our evolution by the moral divine laws, and they're immutable, they're unique because God is perfect and created them perfectly. So the more we evolve, the more we follow the divine laws. So if we're all together following more and more the divine laws, less differences we're going to have, right, in our behavior, in our actions, and how we deal with things. Isn't that funny? So a lot of concepts now. It's like turning to a, more like a discussion of philosophy now. So think about this. So freedom, true freedom, is actually following the rules. It sounds totally crazy if you think about it the first time. But true freedom is actually having the rules of our Creator inside of us. That is true freedom. That is really when you're going to be free, right? When you understand that we're all, and remember, some philosophers actually killed themselves because of this, because they could not tolerate the fact that we're all evolving, and eventually we're all going to be good, right? For some people, it's like taking away their ability to disagree. This is challenging for scientists. But in one day, one day we're all going to be perfect, and that is our road, no matter how we fight against it. We can delay. We can do like our 2-year-old, like throwing ourselves on the ground and kind of do all sorts of things and say, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. We'll do it one day, right? So that is really the perfection that we talk about all the time. Okay, so let's move topics now. Let's talk about sexism, which is obviously something, it's a big topic today, right? That we're talking about all the time. So sexism, by definition, is prejudice, is stereotyping or discrimination or violence against typically women, right? And obviously, it is on the basis of sex, right? But technically, it would be the opposing sex, right? But obviously, we know that based on our society, it happens, obviously, because of the many hundreds of thousands of years of evolution of a male-dominant society. That's how we see, right? Because again, we tend to see physical traits more than spiritual traits, right? We still think about, the weaker, right, version of the humanity, right, being the women, which is an absolutely crazy idea. That was created many thousands of years ago, based on the needs of society. So imagine that. I mean, imagine yourself, like I say, about 30,000 years ago, right? You're living by some sort of water because you needed water, right? You don't have a purifier. You don't have water coming out of a fridge at that time, right? So you needed water. So you kind of settle somewhere where water's close by, and you settle somewhere where you can plant, where you can have some sort of animals that you can take care of. And there are certain things at that time that by biology of our bodies, right, we needed to have more strength to do, right? So males take roles, females take other roles, right? That's kind of how animals and us evolved, right? But we also know now, right, that our society has changed. We have changed. So there's no more distinction of certain roles that we used to have in the past. But because we evolved that way, like humanity evolved by like clear demarcation, separation of roles, we kind of ingrained that as a cultural adaptive system. In other words, like, we as a culture, society, taught that over a long period of time. So people are trained to treat people differently, right? As per society, particularly on the basis of sex, right? And now the class, like now, why we talk about this all the time now? So go back to 30,000 years ago, and we live in a society, and the men were going to do all sorts of things and hunt for lions, something like that, and the women were like taking care of babies, right? We're doing that. So imagine if I go there right now and says, guys, listen, this is sexism. Stop doing this thing, right? So they're gonna put me on fire, right? Like that's a witch or something, like, go on fire. So this is why we talk about this now, because now we're ready to discuss this. This is a real thing, right? So we are evolving. That's a good thing, right? We're all evolving as a society. So what Spiritist talks about? So like Spiritist book, question 200. Are spirits male and female? No, right? The spirits are going to answer. Not as you know it. Because sex depends on the organic composition, so love and sympathy exist among spirits, but they're based on the affinity of sentiments. In this single question, he addresses both transphobia, homophobia, and sexism at the same time, right? Because we as spirits, no, we don't have sex, right? Who has sex? XY chromosomes, biological bodies, yeah, there's sex, but there's a lot of variability there too. I don't have time to go through it, right? But there are variabilities in the biological sex, and there are a million variabilities on gender, or identification of how you identify yourself. We're not the topic of today, right? But we as a spirit, we don't have any of that. I can go into anybody, right? And the affinity happens by sentiments. In other words, by how we love each other. So in other words, you can love anyone you want. The spirits are telling us this. Like, you can read it, maybe use your own prejudice to say, no, I believe this is what you're saying. No, what they're saying is very clear. Affinity happens between spirits. It doesn't matter if it's male or female. Right? Very clear. One question. Bingo, right? 201. Can a spirit who has animated the body of a man animated the body of a woman in their existence, and vice versa? Yes, since the same spirit can animate both male and female body. 2. Clear. Okay. So when we are spirits, do we have a preference as to whether we want to do this or that, or incarnate in the body? So it matters little to the spirit. The spirits, literally read these 3 questions out. So put in a megaphone out there. Maybe people will get that. It matters little. It depends on the trials it must undergo, right? It depends on what I need to do, or I need to learn, or what's my role, right? I can take any role, right? Because they're sexless, spirits can incarnate in either man or woman, since they must progress in every way. So every way, in other words, like in every biological body you incarnate, it doesn't matter what type of genetic components you're going to see, you're going to learn something. How perfect that is, right? So each sex, like each social position, offers specific trials, duties, new opportunities, acquire experience. The one who always incarnated as a man will only know what a man knows. That's going to be a problem, right? Imagine that. It's like your spirit only goes in a man body, right? That wouldn't work, right? I can say that for sure, right? So here's the thing. At that same time, so in 1848 in the United States, about 10 years before this book that I just read, right, there was this massive social unrest in the United States. And it's interesting because women were, at that time, they were talking, and her name is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, right? So she's talking at an anti-slavery protest, right? And she's not allowed to protest against slavery. See how our society is crazy, right? They're protesting against slavery, but because she's a woman, she can't do it. How absolutely nonsensical is that, right? So she did her own thing. So she got a bunch of women, and she went to New York, and she started protesting, like women protesting against slavery. That was like such a shock to society that was really like a big mark on the women's movement, women rights movement in the United States in 1848. It was a really shock, right? So again, just to time it, not only 1850s was the peak of the theory, race theory, right? There was also the peak of women's rights movements starting like in multiple places. And bingo, Spiritism comes right there and throw this big, ginormous piece of information on the game so we can maybe learn from it, right? So, timely, right? Very timely, right? Now, obviously, and we're going to talk about homophobia in a minute, but obviously, nowadays our society has been changing so much that our roles are not very well defined anymore. In other words, in the past, in the animal evolution, right? Yes, you have certain roles that require certain traits, right? So physical traits we're talking about. But nowadays, even that doesn't really exist anymore, right? So if you're working on a computer, right? You don't need to work out every day, right? Just like about that, right? So those typical things that we used to say, oh, men has to do this, women has to do that, those are blurred, right? And they should be, right? Because it doesn't matter. Does it matter? If I'm the same spirit, like, does it matter, right? If I do X or if I do Y, if I take care of the house or if I do that, or if I take care of the kids and my wife works, what is the problem with that? But we're trained as a society to assign roles to people as a way to subjugate them. We do that with society, we did that with people, we do that with countries, we do that with our own houses, right? Women shouldn't do that. How dare people say that? Like, how dare we judge other people on what they should do or not do? But we do it. And some of you in the world out there, listen to us, is going to say, no, this does not happen anymore, right? Until you're faced with a challenge, right? Until you're put on a spot, and you see either a male or female doing something that maybe you don't agree with, the first things that are going to come to your mind is that, you shouldn't be doing this, right? You're a female. That still happens, right? Still today, if you look at the news, people are you put the same news article, and I'll give you an example. You can take an image, I'll give you an example, like the Vice President of the United States. Just put her out there with a speech talking about something, right? I can guarantee you that and this is proven, there's research on it, that the way she's described is 100% different from a male counterpart. What she says, what she does, how she behaves, the words she uses. If she gets emotional, she's weak, right? She's a woman. But if a male gets emotions, like, oh my God, such a big heart, look at that, right? Such a strong man. He's able to cry, right? Still do it. But we fake it that we don't do it, right? But it's right there inside each one of our brains right now as a spirit. We need to get rid of this. Spiritists gave us the tools already 150 years ago. We're still debating this, right? Look at the news. The news are going to always portray, females different than males. In Canada today, which is like a very well-advanced, civilized, economically developed country, and you can think about all the good things about Canada, the pay gap between men and women for the same job is astronomical. The same job, right? We are the same spirit, for Christ's sake. Like, think about this. We are the same, right? We're just in a different body. But no, we don't see it that way, right? We see the body, right? And we assign roles and we judge. So Kardec brings to us all these things. So, and he says, the spirits are going to say, the emancipation of women accompanies the progress of civilization. Their servitude is in step with barbarity. This is 150 years ago, 160 years ago. Besides, sex exists only in the physical organization, and since spirits can become either, there are no differences between them in this respect. Consequently, they should enjoy the exact same rights. Bingo. And we're still fighting. Right? Just to give a little perspective. And I think the historical perspective is interesting. So you know how incredibly new this whole thing was, right? When it was released. Right? And it's still new today for some people. Right? And I don't even have time to go through all this, like pay equity and opportunities and you know, like there's research on every topic you can imagine. Research has shown that in every measurable way, women are treated differently than men. Still, right? And we spiritists should actually fight against this, right? Using the knowledge that we have, right? We're all the same. And we're not all the same, meaning we're genetically the same. We're all the same because as a spirit, I could be either and it doesn't matter, right? And then we're going to finish now. It was like a few minutes. And again, this is now we're talking about homophobia now. And this is one of the topics that it would require a very in-depth study of all the nuances, right, between everything related to it. And obviously, we don't have time for that today. But I'm just going to focus just on homophobia today and a little bit of transphobia, right? So homophobia, by definition, is an aversion, discrimination, or violence against homosexuals, right? In other words, someone has an affection to same sex. That's it. That's as simple as that. Someone who's comfortable in their body, they're just attracted to the same sex, right? Because there are many differences. There are the ones that are not comfortable with their own bodies, and then there's all sorts of variabilities that we're not going to talk about today. Okay. So historical facts. Okay, this is interesting, right? So homophobia. Homosexualism, to be precise, has been treated as a disease for a long time, right? Up to the 1970s or so, 1980s, when it started to change. In 73, the International Classification of Diseases removed homosexualism from actually disease category, so not considered a disorder anymore. So it is normal, right? It's fine. Spiritists brought that along way before. Remember when we talked about the question, we talked about, affinity independent of biological appearances or genetic concepts, right? So Article 1, I'm going to read this because this is interesting. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So Article 1, right? All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. 2, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth by this declaration. So that's a nice summary, right? Do we do that? Do we follow that as a society? We're far away from it, right? Very far away from it. In Spiritism, we know that the differences in sexual identity are 100% determined by the body, right? So what that means is, and this is an interesting concept, right? Because if you look at Spirit's book, again, the same question that I just read before, question number 200, are spirits male and female? They're going to say again, not as you understand it, because sex depends on organic composition. Love and sympathy exist among spirits, but they're based on sentiments, not physical body. Right? There's more. Now, some people read Spiritism literature, particularly more the newer books, the 40s, 50s, and André Luis, and there's a little bit of a bias regarding homosexualism. So, obviously, André Moreira and others have brought a lot of light into this, and we can go through their books. There's a lot of information, and they address every single one of those topics that I'm raising today. But important misconceptions is that if you look at examples, for example, in Action Reaction, for example, in other books, where spirits that have abused their sexual energies and have committed sexual crimes in the past, or they've committed violence against the opposing sex, you're going to get examples of that. This spirit coming back in the other sex, biological sex, right? And they had a hard time adapting. So, there's consequences to that. And somehow link the idea of homosexualism to the fact that you've committed or abused your sexual energies in the past. That is not true. Well, it happens in a few cases, of course. But the reality is that, in Joana de Anjos is very clear about this, the affinity between whatever spirits, it doesn't matter what the body looks like, is part of evolutionary process. It's part of how we grow, right? And is not because of a crime I committed in the past. See, even in Spiritism, people can use spiritual literature to actually be homophobic, right? In a way, saying, yeah, you see lectures sometimes talking about this. They'll come in and say, yeah, some people have a hard time and they're troubled and they come this way. So they come as a homosexuals or gay because of what they've done. No, this is not true. It happens, yes. There are examples of that in spiritual literature. But attaching the idea of being homosexual to something bad you've done in the past, that is a horrible idea. And you see people talking about this all the time, right? No, not true, right? Yes, you abuse your sexual energies. Yes, you're going to have a hard time in the future. It doesn't mean you're going to be homosexual. That makes no sense, right? So just be careful when you take examples out of context, right? Because the Spirit's book, which is really the source of all this knowledge that we're talking about, is absolutely 100% crystal clear about this. Question 200 addresses all those things in 3 lines, right? So we can just follow by that, right? So Emmanuel, for example, in Vide Sexu, talks about this to say respect, affinity, and love, right? Independent of biological sex. He talks about this. Emmanuel is very clear about this, right? So again, just to highlight to us that it's important, right, for us to pay attention to what we're saying, okay? And to finalize now in the last 2 minutes or so, I just want to bring something that Allan Kardec talks about in the Gospel according to Spiritism, right? How we in Spiritism, how we deal with this, right? So Allan Kardec's going to say this in the Gospel. So the mountains that when he's talking about the chapter, I think it's 19, when faith can move mountains, right? There's a comment, right after the passage. He's going to say, the mountains that faith moves are difficulties, resistance, and ill. In other words, all the things found among humans, even when it concerns the best things. Everyday prejudices that we're talking about today, like a big summary, right? Prejudices, material interests, selfishness, blindness, fanaticism, prideful passions are such mountains that bar the way we're all working for towards humankind progress, right? And then he continues in chapter number 17, the moral person. Moral persons are kind, humane, and benevolent toward all, not a few, not the ones that look like you, right? Or believe what you believe, regardless of race or creed, because they regard all people as their brothers and sisters. So again, we can take this entire conversation we had today, go back to Jesus when I say, we're all brothers and sisters, should love one another, and stop telling people how to behave or what to do and what to like and what not like, or what to love or what not love, right? Or judging them by the way they look, or by the biological sex they carry, or by their identity, independent of biological sex or by gender, right? We spend way too much time, right, trying to assign people to categories in a way to control them. We've been doing this in humanity since the earliest ages of society, right? We see what's out there, it's different than us. I assign them to a particular category and I say, this is what it is, and it's by definition worse than me. Still do it, right? We do that work, we do that in society, we do that everywhere, right? So this is the type of behavior that Jesus brought the antidote, the remedy, the solution, right? Kardec kind of expanded it out. He almost like doing like a full-scale production of those pills, right? And now we should take it, right? Which is the moral person. That's what we should focus. Okay? That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marco. So now we're going to be opening 5 minutes or so for questions, for comments. There you go. One question.
One thing that is very common in spirits is for people to talk about when it comes to physical disability.
Yeah.
And they say there is some kind of karma from a previous life and are paying for it. So that's why you're wheel bound.
Yeah.
And this is actually extremely common. I see it very frequently.
Yeah.
And this is also something that maybe we should talk about.
Yeah.
Because in a way, like when the person is in a wheelchair, it is not actually the person's responsibility, right? Like it's up to us to create an environment that the person is going to be able to do everything that any other person would be able to do.
Yeah, this is such an important comment. Yeah, so you're right, and I think Kardec said that. Yeah, if you look back in the Gospel and Media's book, pretty much all of them, he's going to have a comment about the fact of how we tend to try to find explanations for everything now based on the idea of reincarnatory and karma, everything. So, and the fact that we don't know, right? And you're right. Things happen for reasons that are completely beyond our ability to understand. And it doesn't mean that the person did that or did this or will do that. And it doesn't mean that the person is doing something bad. It may be a blessing, maybe what they decided. It could be what we needed. It could be these transformational changes that happen around a single event, right? And a reincarnation can have this incredible effect on the entire environment, entire society sometimes. But we use this little narrow glass that only looks at one thing now because there's one example in Andrea Louise that talked about this. We're like, oh, but yeah, this is what happened for sure. Yeah, she fell off the chair and kind of broke both chairs. Now she's going to come back without a chair. Yeah, like no, right? You're right. And it's so important to talk about this, right? And we should kind of get rid of that, right, in Spiritism, right? In other words, trying to figure out who I was before, who I'm going to be, whether she was incarnated or not incarnated, or discarnated or reincarnated. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, we focus on those things all the time, right? And we spend so much time trying to figure it out. Thank you for your comment. Yeah.
I think this is an important point as well in respect to this notion of karma in Spiritism.
Yeah.
There is no notion of punishment from one life to another. I think what you said is much more relevant, that we have to experience many different types of things.
Correct.
A lot of challenges. Some of these challenges we choose ourselves before we reincarnate. Other challenges are kind of atonement of things that we might have done or we might not have wanted to do in previous lives. This is how we can evolve. So the challenge that we have in this life, and this is where he really marks a real understanding of Spiritism, is a blessing. Because I'm given an opportunity, a second chance, if you may, to move on, to learn, to show that I can do this the right way. I can withstand a life. A lot of this idea of punishment comes on the basis of very limited understanding of the full extent of reincarnations.
Yeah.
We're not talking about 2 or 3 reincarnations in our existence. We're talking about thousands of reincarnations. So one life is just like a small little step. So even if there's a punishment, who cares? Because you punish in this life, if you survive it, then that's okay. But that's not the point. The point is that, yes, there are difficulties that we choose to have in a reincarnation. And yes, we do need the help and loving care of others, but we also have to take responsibilities as much as we can in the context of whatever we have been chosen or been given to us to not only endure, but I would say kind of be happy. I know that's very hard, but let's be pleased that this suffering and the difficulties you're experiencing is going to help you in future lives.
Yeah. I just want to add that being conscious of everything that we go through, everything that we have to see in our lives, our environment, people that comes and go. There's There's for no reason, that you see somebody and you judge right away. So be conscious what you just did. Because if you don't, you're gonna waste a learning process, a blessing, in a way, because that's how we evolve morally. I think this is before we, you have one question?
Yeah.
Just one quick comment because I think it's important. The suffix "es" denotes disorder
Yeah.
or disease, such as Parkinson's.
Mhm.
So homosexualism will denote disease. The best term here in this, because like this lecture, we're broadcasting online.
Yeah.
Best term is homosexuality, which does not
Yeah.
denote disease.
Easy.
It's
Yeah. Yeah.
condition of person.
Thank you, Thiago. Well, thank you so much for everybody who came. Thank you, Marco, for nice and very educating.
That courage to take this topic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's true because it's not easy. And thank you so much for the viewers that are watching us. And please, whoever is here, please do stay for our lunch and learn. It's a good day to get more to know each other. And now we are going to open for our pass. Thank you so much.
Teresa is a great coach.